Hi, my name is Jake Lennon, and this is my final video essay. Sports are often seen, as a level playing field where success is based on talent and performance, but the way these athletes are portrayed, in the media really tells a different story. We look at Jackie Robinson, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, the image of the black athlete in American sports, has been shaped by the media, corporate interests, and even expectations from fans about behaviors. Athletes are not just judged by what they do on the field, but some can even debate more what they do off the field. The image that they put out there. This video, that the goal of this video is to argue that sports media has been historically rewarding to black athletes who remain controlled and marketable. And while those that try to challenge that image, often face criticism or backlash. This pattern goes back to the very beginning of integration of sports. We look at Jackie Robinson back in 1947. When he broke the color barrier. He was told that in order to succeed, you have to kind of fit this mold and remain calm and not react to racism, which is not what you're supposed to tell the victim of racism. Its behavior was probably at the time more important, than his performance. Jackie Robinson was not only proving, that he could compete, but he was also proving, that he could fit into a system where they expected him to fit a certain way. This definitely set the tone for black athletes at the time, on how they'd be treated going forward. They were expected to succeed, but they were also expected to, do so without disrupting the existence of the structure that's been placed onto them. Someone who's definitely challenged that structure, one of probably the first big athletes to do so. We look at Muhammad Ali and his cost of activism. During the 60s, he definitely challenged that system. When he refused to go fight in the war, the Vietnam War, he was stripped of his heavyweight title and banned from boxing for 3 years, which is not talked about enough. Media coverage at the time often portrayed him as a dangerous man, a crazy man. Some even called him unpatriotic. We look at this case, it really shows what happens. This was the first big example of, what happens when an athlete doesn't follow those expectations, and when they don't try to fit that mold. At the time, his success in the ring was pretty much overshadowed, by the person that he was perceived to be outside of it. Unlike Jackie Robinson, who, stayed in silence and, did what he was told, he didn't fight up against it. Muhammad Ali really used his platform as a professional boxer to, speak out. The response he received, shows how quickly the narrative shifts when an athlete really tries to challenge that authority. Now, if we look at 20 years later in the 80s and 90s, we look at Michael Jordan and his marketability. I'd say the NBA was, really trying to expand and kind of reach that audience, and Michael Jordan was the perfect player to do it. I think he was really at the time, he was surely the biggest figure, to expand basketball globally. According to Mary McDonald, which we looked at, Jordan intentionally presented as an apolitical and, universally appealing athlete. He avoided all these controversial topics. He focused directly on basketball and branding. He has his Jordan brand, which has made billions upon billions of dollars. And, I think a big part of that is he stayed out of politics. And sadly, we kind of saw what the successful brand was. We saw how that can help an athlete. Nike and other companies, they built his image around performance, success, reliability. His famous comment that Republicans buy sneakers too, shows an understanding of how important it was to, maintain that image. And I think he did a great job at it. But, I also think it's sad to see that he was really restrained and he couldn't really speak his mind at the time. I'd say Jordan's success at the time definitely created a model, for what the ideal black athlete looked like. Great on the court, quiet off the court. He was dominant when he was playing, but he controlled himself off of it. And I think the NBA took that and ran with it because they knew it was an image that was safe to put out to the globe, a global audience, that he didn't have any of those. He didn't have a voice to really speak out with in a way. Um, I think this connects to I think this perfectly merges into our next, topic point of, racial capitalism and, media framing and how all these media platforms are, kind of profiting off of all these racial identities, but at the same time, they're the ones kind of shaping it and, molding it into what they want it to be. Um, Black athletes have been a huge, part of, I think, sports revenue. But at the same time, their public image is often, shaped to maximize this profit. Um, Media, I think, plays a major, if not the biggest role in reinforcing this. We look at Chris Lamb and his research shows that, athletes are often described differently based on their race. And I'm sure most of the audience has probably heard terms like this. But, when we look at Black athletes, a lot of the times, they're more likely to be described as, athletic or explosive or, shifty. While we look at white athletes and the terms that they're being described as are intelligent or a leader or he has a high IQ, which I think in its own is pretty messed up. But, it goes back to the bigger issue. This type of language influences how, audience understand talent and ability. It also shows that, like, marketability is not just about performance. It's going back, it goes to fit that specific narrative. Like, if we are talking about a Black athlete and they're saying, oh, this guy's athletic, he's God-gifted talent, the audience is going to think that, oh, he didn't work to get to where he is now. He was just born with all these genetics and stuff like that. Even if that's not the case. And, I think it's a very unfair perspective that, unfortunately, a lot of today's audience has. Now if we go a few years later, we look at LeBron James and his time in the NBA. I think there's a big shift in power and a big shift in that model. Like Jordan, both were extremely successful. Both were extremely marketable. I mean, you take your pick. I'm a LeBron guy. But, the thing that I think LeBron did a much better job of was LeBron really used his platform that he had. Michael Jordan had the same platform, but I think LeBron really used his platform to, speak on these social and political issues as where Jordan did not. LeBron's addressed plenty of topics: police violence, education, voting rights. In the documentary Shut Up and Dribble, he makes it clear that, athletes shouldn't just be limited to sports. It should be allowed. They're just as much humans as we are. They should be allowed to, talk about these topics. His approach has definitely changed what it means to be an athlete in the modern era. And though I think the issue's still around, I think LeBron has spearheaded this and, done a great job of, definitely seeing some progress. He's actually seen some criticism himself, though. He's been labeled as too political. That's where the name, the documentary, Shut Up and Dribble, even comes from. A reporter didn't like that he was talking on these topics and told him shut up and dribble, which, that's in a nutshell what this entire issue is. It also reflects that same expectation that, athletes should stay in their lane and, only focus on sports. But LeBron, I think, definitely shows that, both are possible. Now if we try to compare it to the two, even if we look at different sports, there's definitely a double standard in sports in general. I mean, we look at Colin Kaepernick and his protest back in 2016. That's one of the clearest examples. I mean, to protest the police brutality at the time, he was kneeling during the national anthem, and he faced intense backlash. I mean, he basically just got pushed out of the NFL and was done. That was they pushed him out and said forget about it. It was bad. His actions were framed as, controversial rather than meaningful when no one really took the time to hear him out and see what he was doing. Athletes who fit this expected image, they're rewarded, and those who've challenged this image, like Colin, they face the consequence. No matter what athlete we really touch on, no matter what time era we really look at, I think the relationship between race and sports media has sadly been the same for as long as we could really look at. It's the relationship between power and control. I think Black athletes have shaped sports culture for as long as I can remember, but, their image has been often managed to fit what media and corporations find acceptable, and what makes them the most money, sadly. While athletes today, they have more control over their voice, the expectations, they're still there. They're not gone, but they've definitely widened up. Players definitely have more of a voice, but it's still a big issue that I think we need to keep working on every day and every year. Um, the way athletes are portrayed is not just about sports. It reflects larger ideas about race, identity. Who gets to define success. I think it touches on all of these things. And I think there's one main term that I'd love to end this video off with is, I think in sports it's never really about the game. I think a lot of the times it's about who gets to tell that story about the game. Thank you.